Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's great to be with you on this Wednesday, April 27th. And tonight we're talking about life after the pandemic. Not after COVID, just after the pandemic. Dr. Anthony Fauci says America's relationship with this virus has changed.
We don't have 900,000 new infections a day and tens and tens and tens of thousands of hospitalizations and thousands of deaths. We are at a low level right now.
But what if deadlier COVID variants emerge? We'll break down what this means for you and share some of your stories. Our special series on equity in the cannabis industry continues tonight. We'll meet a Republican congresswoman who is pushing to legalize marijuana nationwide. Plus, Russia releases a former Marine to the U.S. in exchange for America releasing a Russian prisoner. What could this prisoner swap mean for basketball star Brittany Griner? And the popular video game Grand Theft Auto 5 is making some changes in its re-release. You'll see how its publisher is addressing some harmful stereotypes from the original game. Ask anyone who writes for this show and they'll tell you we try really hard to avoid cliches in our scripts, but I can't think of a better one to start with tonight. New normal. Sorry. But when it comes to where the U.S. stands with COVID, now may be the right time for that cliche, because it seems like our new normal is right now.
We are certainly right now in this country out of the pandemic phase. Namely, we don't have 900,000 new infections a day and tens and tens and tens of thousands of hospitalizations and thousands of deaths. We are at a low level right now.
Dr. Anthony Fauci made those comments last night, but today he clarified them somewhat to the Washington Post. He said that we are finally out of the full-blown explosive pandemic phase. But he added that now we are shifting to, in his words, a more controlled phase and endemicity. In other words, we're settling into living with COVID. Now, please do not misunderstand. Dr. Fauci is not saying that COVID is over with. Far from it. We could absolutely still see new waves of infections depending on how the virus mutates. But it appears that the U.S. has turned a corner with hospitalizations and deaths. So, COVID's here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. But what does this new phase look like? A lot of you shared your thoughts with us, and they were mixed. Aaron tweeted, "I feel like this is where we've been headed. COVID will be like seasonal colds and flu for most. Some people will get vaccinated and boosted. Some will be seriously ill while others won't. Hopefully people will stay home when they're ill. Too bad we didn't get to this point sooner." And another viewer tweeted, "My elderly mom, who has multiple underlying conditions, had a close COVID contact last week, and I'm on edge, waiting to see if she'll develop symptoms or not. If this is the new normal, I don't like it. Even with great antivirals, I'm very nervous." Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. We'll get to more of them in just a second, but let's begin with NBC medical contributor Dr. Uche Blackstock. She is the CEO of Advancing Health Equity. Dr. Blackstock, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Joshua.
So what do you make of where we stand in the pandemic and Dr. Fauci's comments?
I'll say that when I first heard his comments, I was a little surprised, because when you think about the definition of a pandemic, it means outbreaks globally. And we're still having outbreaks globally. And as you mentioned in the introduction, we don't know what variant is around the corner that will actually have us surging again to the same degree as the Omicron surge, the initial Omicron surge this December. And so I have to say I'm sort of bracing myself. I'm a little wary, but I do feel that we need to figure out, how do we live with COVID in the safest possible way? And that looks like, how do we protect our most vulnerable, people who are immunocompromised and the people who are elderly? Right now, it's not clear to me that everyone has equitable access to those antiviral tablets. So someone like President Bush, he can easily have access to the best medical care as well as Paxlovid. and so can our vice president. But is that the case for everyone in this country, for low income workers or undocumented individuals in this country? That's my concern.
I wonder if we could define that term when he referred to endemicity, to this pandemic
Right.
becoming endemic. In that same interview, Dr. Fauci talked about what he referred to as the control phase that he says the country is transitioning into, where the emergency part of it will settle down. The virus will still circulate, but it won't be quite as devastating as it had been. Dr. Blackstock, what does endemic mean?
Right. So I think that there is this misconception about what it means. What it means is a steady state level of the virus in the background. And so that steady state could be high. There are there are countries in Africa that have endemic levels of malaria, and those are high levels. So endemicity doesn't necessarily mean that transmission levels are low. So I think that's something that we have to really understand. And the ideal would be if we had low levels of coronavirus, because we know that high levels of transmission are directly related to people getting infected and then hospitalized and then dying. So, we are not at that steady state yet because we're still having surges. And the question is, it's still unclear, when will the next surge be? Will we be prepared for it? We know that about 2/3 of the population is fully vaccinated. We know only a fraction of that is actually boosted. And so those numbers really determine what happens when those surges occur, right? How many people are going to be hospitalized? How many people are going to die? There are many different factors, and we really need to get those vaccinations up, as well as those boosters up, because we know that that actually impacts the number of people who are hospitalized and die from this virus.
I want to make sure I understand what you're talking about in terms of this being endemic, because the statistics are not zero in terms of our impact with COVID. The current stats show that we are averaging about more than 50,000 daily COVID cases, about 341 deaths per day. And now the CDC says that roughly 3 in 5 people in the U.S. have had COVID.
Right.
It sounds like what you're saying is that when a disease is endemic, we've learned to live with it, but that does not necessarily mean that we're living well with it. We're just used to it. Do I hear you right?
Right. Yes, to some degree. And it also means that there are no outbreaks that would change the level of the virus significantly. So right now we are in another surge. It's not as significant as the one in December, but we are seeing an increase in cases. And that actually is an undercount because many more people are using those rapid at-home tests. So we are in the middle of another surge due to the BA2 subvariant. We're not able to identify how severe this surge is, but it is happening. So if surges are happening, that is the opposite of what endemicity is, which means that there is a steady state, a steady level of virus. We are still having fluctuations in the level of virus transmission in the community. So that's why I would argue whether or not that's the case. There's a difference between endemicity and the difference between living with COVID.
A few more quick questions I want to get to, and I want to get to the viewer tweet that we have. Forest of Jules tweeted, "Because of my health, it means I have to keep going like it's 2020. Stay at home, social distance, mask, the whole works. It is harder to do now than it was in the beginning because people don't understand." Dr. Blackstock, a few quick things I did want to ask you before I got to let you go. I know that Dr. Fauci is backed out of attending the White House Correspondents' Dinner on Saturday because of COVID concerns. What is your sense of the kind of decision-making we should be engaged in when deciding to get back to normal and moving around?
It's interesting. I think, obviously there has been this shift over the last few months from, sort of policies in place, that protective measures to protect at a population level, to more this shift to individual decision making, which I don't personally agree with, it because I don't think it's the foundation or the tenet of what public health is. But I think we see in this situation with the Correspondents' Dinner that we have Dr. Fauci saying he doesn't want to go, he doesn't feel safe going to this dinner, and President Biden's actually still going. They both are elderly. We know that age is the highest risk factor for doing poorly if you are infected with the coronavirus. But we see them making very, very different decisions. And so, unfortunately, we're at the stage where, again, President Biden actually has access to the best medical care. So he is double boosted, right? It's hard to say that about the rest of the general population. So I would urge people to really think about what are the tools at their disposal. Do they have easy access to Paxlovid? So we actually know that the Test to Treat program has not been as successful as we had hoped. And that's why the Biden administration is pushing that program out even more. And so I think people just need to keep all of these factors into consideration. I personally think a 2,600 attendee event, indoor event, it's potentially dangerous, especially for an older person, although they are checking testing as well as vaccination status. So I guess it's as safe as it could be. But again, these are really complicated decisions that I think also need to happen at a policy level, not just an individual decision-making level.
And of course, it is not too late to get yourself vaccinated or boosted if you have not yet been vaccinated or boosted. Of course, Paxlovid, that's the name of the antiviral pill that is now available for people who test positive. But of course, talk to your doctor. Your mileage may vary.
Yes.
Speak to your personal physician for what is right for you and your situation. Dr. Uche Blackstock, it's always good to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Still to come, we'll bring you part 2 of our special series on equity in America's cannabis industry. We'll introduce you to trailblazers going from behind bars to behind the counter in shops of their own. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. Time now for part 2 of our series, Pot Equity, about the future of the cannabis industry. When it comes to regulations, the states are pretty much on their own. 18 states and Washington, D.C. have legalized recreational marijuana. Many of them are prioritizing vendors with prior pot convictions. You can see the states that have legalized recreational in green on the map. Now, last week, our series focused on New Jersey. Legalized retail began there last week. Tonight, we head to Massachusetts, where equity has been a focus from the start.
Boston is this billion-dollar city, but once you cross a certain neighborhood, that income level drops off. My name is Kobe Evans. I am actually from this area of Dorchester, which is a part of Boston, and the name of the business is Pure Oasis. We're Boston's first recreational cannabis dispensary. We sell a lot of flower, we sell a lot of edibles, and then everything in between. You know, when we started, it was just, okay, let's open one store, and then we had a lot of momentum.
When we hit that 5-year mark, there were 18,000 people who were being employed in this state from cannabis. And in revenue, we're approaching the $3 billion mark. At this point, revenue sales for cannabis in the state of Massachusetts have outpaced alcohol sales in the state. Massachusetts was the first state in the country to have equity baked into our mandate. And we're realizing, you know, what's worked, what needs some tweaking, what needs to be revised, and where are we?
I think Massachusetts built a great model, and I think that we are continuing to improve on that model.
One of the things that was created at the beginning was that list of designated areas that have been most harmed by the war on drugs.
If you live in certain census tracts, then that qualifies you to be designated as social equity or economic empowerment. I know that trauma that exists from growing up in a neighborhood where it's over-policed. Well, this neighborhood has probably had its fair share of violence and deaths and gang violence. That was a lot of motivation to see high school friends die and to see people go away to jail for, decades, and, all the things that were harmful. Weed was just never one of those things, but it was used as a tool to police people.
Where are we in terms of getting people in this industry that have already been a part of the cannabis industry, but just not in the regulated market?
This is our retail backstock vault. So I was arrested in Norton selling cannabis. I was caught with 70 pounds and about $250,000 in cash. And that was really the end of a long run that I had of selling wholesale in the illegal industry. We have a show flower room window, which is an eye catcher. I spent 9 months in a prison cell for something we're doing legally right here in my hometown now. And that to me is it's eye-opening, and we've come so far in such a little bit of time. We're very small craft cultivation, and we're about 7,000 square feet of canopy space, so that's actual plant canopy. So again, small compared to the industry. The industry, up to 100,000 square feet for a tier 10.
Up until 5 years ago, I thought this was a business for criminals and children. I was working in Manhattan. I was running a trading desk. We've raised a little over $10 million, a blend of both equity and debt, and it's expensive. It's expensive to do. It's certainly challenging, and operating costs are millions.
So for 80% of the people who want to get into the industry, funding is the issue. Whatever is bigger than a roadblock, that's what funding tends to be, depending upon the size of your property, where you're located. Could be $30,000 a month in terms of holding costs. It could be $5,000 a month just in terms of the real estate. If you have an attorney involved, that adds another fee to it. And so, you had to leverage friends and families and assets and credit cards and scrape together the money. And, we did a lot of the work ourselves just to get open.
It's not an easy thing to do to roll out a social equity program and to try and make it completely inclusive for those who were harmed by the war on drugs.
And the reality is there is still a lot to be done.
War on drugs has become the War on Drugs 2.0 within the cannabis space, and a lot of people aren't talking about it. My name is Alfonso Tucky Blunt Jr. I am owner of Blunts & More. I'm the first ex-felon for selling cannabis to have a cannabis retail shop. I was arrested in 2005 for selling cannabis with firearm possession about 13 blocks from here, 10 years of probation with a 4-way search clause, felony charges for $80 worth of cannabis and a firearm, a registered firearm. All the stuff that we went through behind cannabis. And people are still in jail for this. Let's just be clear. There's people still in jail right now for cannabis, and I'm selling cannabis in my store right now. When we got our license, there was no money for anybody in the equity program. So we had to go find people that would be willing to lend us money or invest money into our business. Oakland has some of the highest taxes in the country for cannabis, probably in the world. I would love for me to be up here saying that, I'm making millions and millions of dollars and this is going great. It's not. I'm not making anything. And then when we don't have access to the banking, we're targets because they think we have a bunch of cash just on us.
The unbanked, currently legal dispensaries are often the targets of organized crime.
With a dispensary owner shot by an armed robber in Oakland.
Cannabis merchants say it's just the latest example of their industry under attack.
So here you see one of the suspects coming out of our business holding 2 bags of product.
Well, we've been targeted 4 times. We've been hit twice. We have to have armed guards, 2 to 3. We have to build our shops kind of like banks. We have to have safes that are like, biggest 3 or 4 people. One of my other fellow cannabis club owners just got hit a couple nights ago. It's really to that point where a lot of us are like, F this.
Getting a license is one thing, and there are costs associated with that. But keeping your license is a whole other story.
I sell weed, to make money. Let's just be clear. There's no reason for me to be in business and not make any money. If I do another 3 years like this, I'm leaving.
My fear is that automatically when you legalize it on the federal level, you now open the door for what's called interstate commerce.
I will lay myself down to do everything I can to stop an easy banking bill that's going to allow all these corporations to make a lot more money off of this, as opposed to focusing on the restorative justice aspect.
Smaller businesses and communities of color are not left out as marijuana is legalized and sold across the country.
Whether it's big pharma, big tobacco, big agriculture, big food, there are a lot of players who have been holding off for federal legalization.
I know the intentions behind statutes and laws as they're being developed, but we know that once they are enacted into law, the reality sometimes shifts.
It has to be done right. Putting us in the room with the lawmakers and having them listen to what we're going through in order to help them craft the laws.
They don't acknowledge it as a legitimate industry, but they sure are collecting our tax dollars for it. So it's that perfect example of taxation without representation.
My local congressperson may say, this is going to be good for the industry as a whole, and they may be looking out for our best interest, but there may be kind of an unintended consequence of this legalization that they didn't see. Once you flip that switch, you can't, unring the bell.
So we have seen how different states are handling cannabis. But what about the U.S. government? Up next, you'll meet a Republican congresswoman sponsoring a bill to legalize marijuana. Nancy Mace joins us after the break. And later this hour, we have an update on the war in Ukraine, including the horrific situation right now in Mariupol. A number of states are legalizing cannabis while addressing the legacy of marijuana prosecutions. We have been looking at how some states are handling this, but pot is still illegal under federal law. Let's continue now with a congresswoman who proposes to change that. Nancy Mace is a Republican from South Carolina. Her district is in the Charleston area, and she is sponsoring the States Reform Act, a Republican-led bill to decriminalize marijuana. Representative Mace, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me this evening.
What made you decide to sponsor this bill? What is it about legalization that's important to you?
Well, this is an issue that I worked on in the state legislature. I was a state lawmaker for 3 years before coming to Congress. I'm a freshman member of Congress. It's actually Republicans in the state of South Carolina who are working on cannabis reform, specifically the Compassionate Care Act for medical cannabis in South Carolina. And this particular issue is personal to me. I was raped when I was 16. I dropped out of school. I became a waitress at a Waffle House. I learned some really tough lessons during some very tough times and learned the value of hard work during that time. But I also learned about prescription drugs, and I was prescribed an antidepressant that made my depression worse. And I quit taking that prescription drug and I started using cannabis for a brief period of time in my life. And I attribute my survival of this very traumatic experience with the ability to have access to cannabis. And it's much different back then than it is today because there's fentanyl on the streets. And there are a number of different reasons why we need to do this at the federal level to allow states to control how they do or do not do cannabis in each respective states. And that's essentially what the States Reform Act does. And I talk to a lot of people, whether it's veterans with PTSD, whether it's folks that have epilepsy, there are any number of reasons, cancer, end of life, et cetera, to be able to have access and opportunity to this. And as the gentleman that you had on here earlier today, the opportunity that's out there for folks who've been wrong. This has been a very, very expensive, very long, very painful, and very harmful war on a plant, and it's time to end it.
I appreciate you sharing your personal story. I'm so sorry that you went through that, but I'm grateful to you for telling us about that. And I think that clarifies for me, Congresswoman Mace, a bit of your rationale. It sounds like more of your reasoning for this has to do with the potential medicinal benefits of cannabis as an alternative to some medications for treating, in your case, depression, as opposed to the more recreational use argument behind legalization.
Right. And the beauty of the States Reform Act is that your state could legalize it for anything that it wants, whether that's recreational or medical use, like in Florida. They have medical cards in Colorado, California, Oregon, et cetera, and 15 other states. They have full adult use. The beauty of the States Reform Act is it could be state by state. There are only 3 states in the country that have no CBD or no cannabis whatsoever. And one of those states is getting ready to go from 0 to medical. And so we need to have a framework, a regulatory framework that treats cannabis like alcohol, which is the States Reform Act, that gives states the power and the control to implement cannabis and in whatever way, shape, or form they want, or they can prohibit it. But at this point, there are only 2 states that have nothing at this juncture. And it's past time that the federal government get out of the way of what's already been happening in 47 of 50 states for, in some cases, almost or over 2 decades.
You know what, Congresswoman, I think I need to clarify the way we characterized your bill up front. I think we misspoke. It sounds like the way you want to go about this, as you just said, is allowing states to treat cannabis as they see fit, more like alcohol, where from state to state, if you live in the Northeast, Pennsylvania regulates it very differently than New Jersey, than New York, like across state lines, it can vary, as opposed to nationwide legalization. Those sound like 2 different things. I just want to make sure we characterize your bill right.
Yeah, and the way that we talk about it, I think, is really important because the only way that you can have cannabis reform at the federal level is you have to have Republicans on board. In fact, you've got to have 10 Republicans in the U.S. Senate. And so when we're talking about this issue, it's how do we do it in a bicameral and bipartisan way? What kind of legislation will guarantee that it can pass and get sent to the president's desk for signage? Now, the U.S. House just passed the MORE Act. It does not have Republican support in the Senate. And so it's really essentially dead on arrival. It's still to be determined, TBD, whether or not Senator Schumer does his own variation of legislation. And so the only bill left standing is the States Reform Act. And that's the way that you get Republicans and Democrats on board. I don't have the social equity components that the MORE Act has, but we have expungement and release, and we leave social equity up to the states because the government closest to the people is a government that governs best. And we've got to have low taxes. As a gentleman from California said earlier in your program, he's there to have a business and make a profit, and the taxes are very high, and he is targeted by illegal markets and those that are doing cannabis business illegal. And we've got to keep taxes very low so that these folks who are trying to have this opportunity and create a business and create a life for themselves, a quality of life, they can survive and have a legally operating business. And when you treat cannabis like alcohol is treated nationwide, state by state, that opportunity is there, and it essentially is turnkey, because you have a framework that's already existed with alcohol for decades now, and would make this really essentially legal overnight, state by state.
I kind of hear you in terms of the state by state approach, and I tend to think that states would kind of move in that direction anyway. I mean, there's a Rasmussen poll that puts Republican support for national marijuana legalization at 54% right now, Democratic support at 68%. So the tide has already kind of turned in that direction. Let me get to a few comments from our viewers before I got to let you go. Cecil emailed, after I had a heart attack, the positive effects of cannabis became an important component of my recuperation. Such a change can only be described as life-changing. Art emailed, although I think people who have genuine medical issues that need marijuana for medical use is fine, what these people need to realize is, even though they can use marijuana for medical purposes, they do not have the right to blow smoke in other people's faces or get others high. Before we go, Congresswoman, I wonder what your sense is of the continually evolving views on cannabis. I think that's partly why it's made so many people, not everyone for sure, but a critical mass of people so upset that Congress has not found a way to do this yet, has not found a way to just kind of get with the times.
Yes, and it is frustrating when you hear about people who are sick or ill, particularly in my family. I had a recent diagnosis of a member of my family who's sick, and it makes me angry that there is something that is out there that they could take and help them through their illness, and I can't get them access to it legally. It's very frustrating. But what I have seen, and I'm a conservative in a swing district, but I don't represent just conservatives. And in bright red South Carolina, in the 1st Congressional District, the vast majority of people want full adult recreational use. And I polled the reddest and most conservative Republican primary voters in my district, and almost 2/3 of them support the rights of states to legalize or prohibit the use of cannabis in any form that people want, that voters of that state want. And so when you start to look at this and realize that it's got to be done in a bipartisan way, there is a path to doing it, and that is responsible, that protects kids, that protects veterans, but that protects those with serious illnesses. We can do this. And I encourage folks to look up the States Reform Act and learn for yourselves and how we can do it in both chambers, both the U.S. Senate and the House, and work together, finally find something that will unite us rather than divide us. And this is one of those places.
It's so interesting to hear a very different argument on the left in terms of legalization, in terms of social equity and, the changing times, as opposed to your argument as a conservative in terms of what I guess we could broadly call compassionate use, kind of in that sort of thread of political thought about that allowing states to also make their own decisions, kind of like alcohol. I'll be very interested to see where this goes from here. But for now, Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace of South Carolina, I really appreciate you making time for us tonight. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for having me on this evening.
We'll get to some of today's other top stories in a moment, including a prisoner exchange between the United States and Russia, a live report on the latest developments in Ukraine, and today's memorial for the late Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. That's all just ahead. Stay close.
It's not going to hit us until we see him.
I mean, we're excited. We know he's on the plane, but I think we're really it's going to really hit us when we get to put our arms around him and hug him.
A veteran of the U.S. Marines imprisoned in Russia is coming home. Today, Russian state TV showed Trevor Reed being led onto an airplane. Now, NBC News cannot confirm when or where this video was made, but Trevor Reed is part of a prisoner swap with Russia. In exchange for him, President Biden commuted a 20-year prison sentence for a Russian pilot convicted of drug trafficking.
Of Trevor Reed was a culmination of months and months of intense discussions with Russian officials. But I should add, these were discussions about one thing and one thing only, the safe release of Trevor Reed.
NBC's Jay Gray has more on the swap.
Trevor Reed is free tonight. This Russian TV video showing the former U.S. Marine at the Moscow airport almost 1,000 days after American officials say he was unjustly detained. The 30-year-old released in a prisoner exchange for a convicted Russian drug trafficker.
Finally, after waiting all this time, I'm going to be able to hug my kid, put my arms around him.
We're deeply grateful to our allies and partners who helped in this effort to bring him home.
Reed's health has been deteriorating since he contracted COVID last year. The surprising flash of diplomacy comes as tensions over the war in Ukraine intensify. Russia cutting the supply of natural gas to Poland and Bulgaria. The European Union calling the move blackmail. President Vladimir Putin warning the response to any allied interference in the conflict will be, quote, lightning fast. The Russian Defense Ministry saying it's hit an arms depot filled with weapons and ammunition from the U.S. and Europe, while troops continue their relentless attack on key cities, including Mariupol.
Mariupol is completely erased. This is the results of the barbarian action of President Putin.
New satellite images appear to show a third mass gravesite outside the battered city. Jay Gray, NBC News, Washington.
Meanwhile, Russia is retaliating against 2 NATO countries for sending military aid to Ukraine. It's cutting off natural gas shipments to Poland and Bulgaria. Russia has accused this Western alliance of waging a proxy war in Ukraine, and this appears to be its toughest act of retaliation so far. NBC's Cal Perry joins us from Kyiv with more. Cal, what more can you tell us about this decision to cut off the natural gas shipments?
Well, listen, I don't think it comes as a total surprise to Western officials. It seems to be timed and retaliation for the amount of weapons that are headed in here, recent comments by the U.S. Defense Secretary and Secretary of State, and the kinds of weapons that we're seeing here. Poland, for their part, says it's not really going to affect them, at least not in the near term. They say they have about 70% of their storage facilities full. Bulgaria seems to be in a little bit more difficult position. The European Commission has stepped up and said they're actually going to be putting natural gas into those countries. It brings up a double-edged sword, I think, though, for Russia as well. I mean, this was a card they had to play. Clearly, this is a sanction they can put in. But look, they need this revenue. You heard the U.S. Defense Secretary say over the weekend that America really wants to see Russia weakened. It wants to see it unable to replenish both its military equipment and its fighters. It needs this gas revenue to do both of those things, Joshua.
Yeah, and we know that some countries in Europe have been very nervous about the impact of Russian energy supplies as a form of retaliation. The UK had decided to kind of wind down its business with Russia for energy over the course of the year because they're so tightly connected. Let me ask you about Kyiv. The U.S. Embassy there tweeted that it could be up and running, in their words, as soon as possible. What's it like in the capital right now in terms of the environment that the embassy staff will be coming back to?
Well, the capital itself feels like a city at war, certainly a city that is under the threat of airstrikes, though there have not been airstrikes here in about 10 days. The security situation is far different than it was a few months ago. There's more checkpoints. There's more buildings that have been hardened. And I think the security is at a level of which they're certainly concerned. One of the things that has happened recently, though, in the last 24 to 48 hours are these explosions on the Russian side of the Russia-Ukrainian border to the north. And we're talking about an arms depot, and we're talking about 2 oil facilities. Now, the Ukrainian government is not claiming responsibility for the attacks, nor is the Ukrainian military. They're being very cagey about it. There was this tweet from a senior advisor to the president in which he says this is karma for all the bodies that Russia is piling up in Ukraine. But they, again, don't take responsibility for it. Part of the reason we think for the sort of vagueness of it is we've had recent comments by Vladimir Putin that he could strike here in the capital if those explosions continue. You can expect that the U.S. State Department is going to keep an eye on that will dictate sort of how quickly they get the embassy open and how functional that embassy is to be, Joshua, though I think we all know that it really is the symbolic nature of opening this embassy that the U.S. really wants to execute.
And before I let you go, in Mariupol, officials there claim to have found a 3rd mass grave. What more do we know?
So it's either a 3rd separate grave or it could be a 3rd slit trench. It's a long slit trench. It's over 200 meters long. It's sort of in keeping with what they've found there in the past. The situation there continues to deteriorate. Just tonight, too, we heard from a Marine commander, a Ukrainian Marine commander from inside that steelworks factory. That clock is at the top of that steelworks factory. And he was saying he has some 600 Marines with him that are badly wounded that he wants to be able to evacuate. He was calling on international aid groups to try to organize some kind of ceasefire. But look, every time Vladimir Putin says he's not going to fire on that area, it seems like his troops then do. So there's no trust between either side in that city. And it just seems like, as hard as it is to imagine, day 63 of nonstop bombardment in that city, it actually seems as though it's getting worse, Joshua.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. Thank you, Cal. That's NBC's Cal Perry reporting for us tonight from Kyiv. U.S. Border Patrol will continue turning away asylum seekers at the Mexican border under a new federal ruling. Today, a federal judge in Louisiana blocked the Biden administration from lifting a Trump-era immigration policy. It had blocked asylees under a COVID-era restriction known as Title 42. Today's ruling keeps that policy in place for 2 more weeks. The judge will hold another hearing on May 13th. President Biden had planned to lift the restriction on May 23rd. A source tells NBC News the administration is considering an appeal if the judge lets Title 42 remain longer. Today, President Biden gave the eulogy for former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Her funeral was held today at the Washington National Cathedral. During his eulogy, the president described Secretary Albright as a force for good in the world.
To Madeleine, from my perspective, there was no higher mission, no greater honor than to serve this great experiment in freedom known as the United States of America. With her goodness and grace, her humanity, and her intellect, she turned the tide of history.
Other notable guests and speakers included the Clintons and the Obamas. Madeleine Albright was President Clinton's Secretary of State from 1997 to 2001. NBC White House correspondent Mike Memoli has more on the service and the tributes. Hey, Mike.
You know, Joshua, anytime Washington and with it the country says goodbye to a figure like Madeleine Albright with a funeral like we saw today at National Cathedral, there are really 2 dynamics. The first, of course, is remembering the person, and we certainly heard that today, remembering the former Secretary of State who made history as the first woman in that office as a diplomat, but also as a mother. Her daughters with very moving tributes devoted to the role she played in their lives and the country's as well. We also heard it from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who talked about the trailblazing way that she approached her office and was a mentor to a generation of women who came behind her in the diplomatic corps. But there's also, in these moments, a reference to the journey of the history of America, as President Biden would put it, a reflection on where that person stood and how it represented where we are as a country. And that was absolutely the case for a woman who came to this country as an immigrant, who was a fierce advocate for democracy and for freedom, and really a Paul Revere in a way in the warnings that she made, especially in the last half decade, about the rise of authoritarianism and the risk of fascism as she saw it in the predecessor's administration. There were tributes today not just from her family but from former presidents. The president who nominated her in 1997 to be the Secretary of State, Bill Clinton, talking about how she advocated within the administration to take a stronger line in responding ultimately militarily to what was referred to as a genocide in the Balkans from Slobodan Milosevic, the breakup of Yugoslavia and Bosnia specifically. And then from President Biden, who really presided over her confirmation hearing that back then when he was the top Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee, talking about how her warnings, her role as well in playing a role in NATO expansion in the 1990s was really symptomatic of the role and the fight that the president is now overseeing as Ukraine deals with Russian aggression at the time. The president saying that she was somebody who was proud to be American and somebody who made us proud to be Americans as well, calling her a force for freedom throughout the world. Now, some notes as well about some of the accessories we saw in the cathedral during this service. It was notable that just like Madeleine Albright did throughout her career, many of, especially the women in the audience, were wearing pins, different brooches. Albright, of course, wore different ones to sort of send an unspoken message at times. And also we noted, of course, that all attendees, including the former presidents, the diplomats, the representatives of other governments, were wearing masks. Just yesterday, of course, Vice President Kamala Harris, being the latest top official to be diagnosed with COVID-19, President Biden this week with a number of very crowded public engagements today's following the events of the week, including the White House Correspondents' Dinner this weekend and a tribute that he will be making to another major figure in his life and in American life on Monday, Walter Mondale, his memorial service in Minnesota on Monday. Joshua.
Thank you, Mike. That's NBC's Mike Memoli reporting from Washington. More companies are coming out with electric vehicles. Yesterday, Ford unveiled its F-150 Lightning. But when you have to recharge an EV, where's the nearest station? We'll tell you about a plan to add more before we go. The popular video game series Grand Theft Auto rewards players for all kinds of antisocial behavior. That's kind of the fun of it. But the game's latest update makes it a bit more pro-social, in step with the times. The game's publisher, Rockstar Games, has reportedly removed transphobic content from the remastered edition of Grand Theft Auto 5. That re-release came out on March 15th. GTA 5 had featured background characters that critics said played on harmful stereotypes of trans people. Last year, that prompted an open letter from Outmaking Games, a gaming industry group of LGBTQ professionals. The letter reads in part, quote, "The game appears to purposefully play into extremely harmful stereotypes of trans and gender-diverse people to encourage players to be repulsed by them and even to relish hurting and killing them," unquote. Now, Rockstar Games has not publicly acknowledged this change or the reasons behind it, and NBC News is still awaiting comment from the company. But joining us now to discuss it is Ian Bogost, a contributing writer at The Atlantic. Mr. Bogost, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Great to be here.
I ask this, of course, with some sensitivity to viewers who may be triggered by this or who may find this offensive, but could you describe in a little more detail what Grand Theft Auto 5 contained in its pre-mastered edition as it related to trans characters, or at least characters who are perceived as gender diverse?
There were a couple things that we've noticed thus far. Some background action figure packaging that had some insensitive descriptions on the packaging, and then some characters that were described in the game sometimes as drag queens or as transvestite characters outside a nightclub in the game that had dialogue about, you know, taking hormones, or sometimes other characters would ask if they were men or women. So those are the things that we know of that have been removed from the game.
What does this mean in terms of the overall image of Rockstar Games? I mean, Rockstar Games, Take-Two Games, how much of a history do they have of this kind of content or socially questionable content in their most popular titles?
I mean, the whole series, the whole Grand Theft Auto series since the outset has thrived on controversy, on offense. It's a game about being a criminal and performing criminal acts, and it's always been startling to people in every way. And the company uses that image as a way of popularizing its titles. There was a infamous sex scene in the game that wasn't supposed to be there. Some retailers took it off shelves. That was back in 2004. There's a kind of interactive torture scene in GTA 5. You can murder animals. The whole game has always been pretty misogynistic. Women are mostly props or prostitutes. So there's still a lot of offense in this game and in the series.
What's the attitude or the appetite like among gamers as you see it for that kind of content? I mean, I'm a gamer, and I remember GTA. I remember Vice City, which is modeled after Miami. I'm from South Florida, so I recognized every single street on Miami Beach. But there are other games that have that kind of strong content. Cyberpunk 2077, for example, has very intense violence. There is a rather explicit gay sex scene in the game that, depending on the choices you make, you can access. So what is the attitude like for all kinds of explicit content these days?
I mean, these are games that are meant for adults, and they're meant to be titillating. They're meant to push the envelope. That's what makes them sell. But I think what's different about this change is that these depictions of trans characters weren't doing anything for the game. They weren't interesting. They were just negative representations that really added nothing. No, there was nothing humorous about them. There was nothing incisive. And I suspect that's why the company chose to remove them in response as well to the call to remove those negative representations.
How much of this is coming from everyday gamers? I mean, I can imagine that some gamers would agree with you in terms of whether this explicit content actually does anything for the story. The gay sex interlude in Cyberpunk, for example, is as a result of a storyline that at least I did not see coming, and it definitely added to the story, and it made the story make more sense. And I think some players would look at this and say, yeah, that's why we bought GTA 5. We knew it was going to be dirty and inappropriate and lewd, and that's why we wanted it.
And that's still there in the game. I don't even think that these depictions were lewd, as I said, or even really interesting. I think that the average gamer, though, still might not want anything to be taken out of their game. And there's a long history of abuse, misogyny, transphobia, and other kinds of harassment online from gamers, even in response to some of the calls to remove this specific content in the game. So it's hardly a widespread position among the whole of the vocal gamer sector. But, a lot of different kinds of people are playing games. This game has sold over 150 million units, GTA 5 has. And all of those folks, that many people, represent a large diversity of the population.
And we should be clear before I let you go that this is a remaster of a game that came out more than a minute ago. So part of this is probably just about the bottom line, trying to get more people to buy the game.
I think that's right. The game came out in 2013, and this and other games that have removed content for the same reasons, they've realized it was a while ago. It was 10, 15 years ago, and we're, catching up with changing social values, and we see a benefit in updating the games for that reason.
Yeah, this game came out like right after Instagram was founded. This was almost in a pre-Instagram universe.
It's been a while.
It has been a while. Ian Bagost of The Atlantic, appreciate you making time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before we go, let us follow up on a question from a viewer about electric vehicles. Yesterday, we reported on Ford releasing its all-electric F-150 Lightning. But a viewer asked, where are we going to charge all these new cars? Who's building that infrastructure? Well, the Biden administration is putting billions behind this, but what does the road to charging millions of new cars look like? NBC technology correspondent Jake Ward has that story.
Climate scientists do agree that at this point we really need to swap out all of our vehicles and make them into electrified vehicles. And the Biden administration is pouring money into creating new networks of chargers across the country so that nobody runs out of power as an electric vehicle driver. Well, we then ask the question, okay, what happens if all 250 million plus vehicles in the U.S. really do become electric? How will we charge them all? We looked at the technological options for making that possible.
Grad student Victor Tran loves his electric car.
There's no oil change, no transmission stuff. It's really nice.
The only problem is finding a charger on campus.
I drove up to where I usually might charge. Looks like all the spots are full. It's really annoying that there's no spots.
We'll build out the first ever national network of 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations.
President Biden's $5 billion program hopes to create highway corridors full of them. But experts say with 35 million EVs expected on the road by 2030, we'll need another 1.5 million charging ports, especially in cities.
It's easy to make it accessible to just about anybody, whether you live in a single-family home or whether you're in a city and you're depending on off-street parking or an apartment.
ChargePoint has been making charging stations for 15 years, testing them against the elements at its lab in San Jose.
How does it work? Take your phone, hold it up to the station.
Its CEO says its worldwide network of 174,000 chargers means you don't need to fill up every night.
You're topping up a little bit at work. You're topping up a little bit when you go shopping or have dinner.
Some Starbucks and Taco Bell customers will soon see chargers in the parking lot, for instance. But a full charge can take anywhere from 20 minutes to several hours. John D'Souza says that model is all wrong.
If you need it to be your one vehicle and work well, it has to work as easily as gas.
His company, Ample, builds robotic stations that swap in a fully charged battery for San Francisco fleet vehicles and Uber drivers in 10 minutes. You don't even have to get out of the car to do the swap.
It's fully autonomous.
With swapping stations and standardized batteries, D'Souza says, you'll never have to worry about your battery getting old.
With battery swapping, you can keep that car for as long as you want.
Your range might actually improve over the life of the car.
Exactly.
Romano says within 20 years, drivers won't be anxious about finding a charger. We'll be anxious about finding gas.
When the dominant is electric, there are only going to be a certain number of gas stations that are going to be solvent.
It really does take a sort of psychological shift to imagine the world in which you're basically constantly charging up. There are even initiatives in which the road itself might charge your car. But the good news here is that we do, it turns out, have the technology to either keep topping up wherever you go or to just swap out your battery wholesale. The real question is just, do we now have the money and the will as a nation to go ahead and swap out our gas power for an all-electric future?
That is the question. Thank you, NBC's Jake Ward. Hey, remember to send us your questions and stories about free speech on Twitter. Our experts will answer them this Friday. We're at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Leave us a brief but brilliant voicemail, 888-575-2NBC, or email nowtonight@nbcnews.com. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for making time for us. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.